Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to this Helen Clark Foundation and WSP webinar. We're just going to start our hui today with karakia. Whakarongo, whakarongo, whakarongo ake au ki te tangi a te tui. Tui, 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 tui a. Tui a I runga, tui a I raro, tui a I waho, tui a I roto. Ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te au, ka au, ka au, ka awatea. Tihei, mauri ora. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, nau mai ki tēnei hui. Ko wai au, no ingarangi me kotirana o ki tipuna, I tipu au I raro I te raukura o te Aotearoa I te pito o te Oni, ko Holly Waka tōku ingoa, no pito Oni a hau, no reira tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody and thank you so much for joining us. My name's Holly Walker. I'm the Deputy Director and WSP Fellow at the Helen Clark Foundation, and I'll be hosting and facilitating our conversation today. I'd like to start by acknowledging all of our speakers, whom I'll introduce shortly, and also to acknowledge our hosts and partners at WSP. So for those who are not familiar with either the Foundation or WSP, the Helen Clark Foundation is a public policy think tank based at AUT University and founded on the values that have shaped the career of our patron, Helen Clark. And we're very fortunate to have a partnership with WSP, which supports a research fellow at the Foundation who looks into, I guess, big public policy challenges that have an urban form or a transport component, primarily on topics that are of mutual interest to our two organisations. So I've been very fortunate to be that person for the last 2 years. And the report that we have recently launched, and which is the sort of springboard for our discussion today, Te Ara Matatika, or the Fair Path, is the 5th report in that partnership. And it looks at the relationship between the transport system and equity, and how we can equitably and fairly decarbonise our transport system in our cities in Aotearoa. So we're so grateful to have WSP's ongoing partnership and support of the Foundation, and we're really delighted that we have WSP's Pou Whanake, the Technical Director Māori, Kumeroa Pihama, as one of our panellists today, and I'll introduce him more fully shortly. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. I'm sure you've been on many Zoom webinars by now, so this will all be familiar to you, but just a few quick points. We're in webinar mode, so as participants, your cameras and sound are disabled, so don't worry about interrupting us or accidentally turning on your camera. It's not possible for you to do that, so you can relax and enjoy the conversation. But you can still participate. So if you would like to ask a question of our panelists, feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom to drop your questions in there. And also keep an eye on those as the webinar is going along, because you have the ability to like the ones that you're most interested in, and that will bump them up to the top. So when it comes time for the Q&A, I'll be selecting primarily from the ones that are towards the top of that list. So a good way to ensure that you're interested in the questions that we'll be answering towards the end of the panel. And you can also chat with each other in the chat function. So please feel free to say hi in there. Not all of the panelists will be actively monitoring the chat, but if you'd like to talk amongst yourselves or to each other or share relevant links in the chat, please feel free to do so. It's also a good place to direct any technical queries that you might have in terms of following the webinar or any issues like that. And our colleague Paul Smith is monitoring the chat for that and running the back end of the webinar. So feel free to drop those in there. And finally, we've got closed captioning or live transcript switched on for this webinar, which is the first time we've done that on one of our webinars. So I'm really interested in your feedback on that. So if you're interested in following the live captions, you can do that. You can switch that function on using the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. And it's a bit of an experiment because it's robots who are transcribing what we're saying. So if you've got thoughts or feedback about how that works, please do let us know. I'll drop my email address into the chat later and you can send me an email about that. So just to let you know how this will run, I'm going to share a very quick couple of slides in a minute just to introduce the report that we're talking about, Te Ara Matatika. It won't take long at all, just to set the scene really. Then I'll introduce each of our panelists and we'll have a facilitated discussion for about half the time, which I'll kind of lead and structure. And then for about half the time, we'll have Q&A from you as our audience. So please do put your questions in that Q&A function. And then we'll have some final comments and wrap up at 1 o'clock. So I'll just briefly introduce the report. So excuse me for a second while I share my screen to do that. Right, hopefully that's working for everybody. So this is the report. It's called Te Ara Matatika, The Fair Path. And really it begins with a vision. And that vision is basically that everybody in Aotearoa should be able to get where they need to go affordably, safely, and on time, and in ways that protect the planet. And we argue in the report that in order to achieve this goal, and in fact to have any chance of meeting our emissions reductions targets, we basically need to reprogram our transport system around two key objectives. And those are reducing our collective dependence on private cars as our main form of urban transport, and also making our transport system work better for those who are currently disadvantaged. And really just to illustrate the issues in the report, I want to introduce you to a couple of fictional characters. So this is Hannah. Hannah's 21 and she lives with her family and she's studying to be a social worker. And she also has a part-time job a few nights a week that's late at night cleaning offices in the CBD. So she, as I said, she's a fictional composite, but I think her story is representative. So Hannah bought a car 6 months ago, thinking that it would be the cheapest and most convenient transport option for her. It was faster than the bus to university, and there's cheap student parking near campus, so it wasn't much more expensive either. And also she felt safer using it late at night to get home after her cleaning job because the buses at that time of night are not very frequent, and understandably she doesn't like waiting a long time by herself. Unfortunately, Hannah has bad credit from an old debt, so her bank won't lend her the $3,000 she needed to buy the car, so she ended up taking out a loan from a high interest lender with offices nearby her home. So she's paying quite high repayments for that car. And then unfortunately, at its last warrant of fitness, the car needed 2 new tyres, which she couldn't afford, so she switched to taking the bus to uni. But she kept driving to work at night because she didn't want to wait at the bus stop by herself. She's been hassled there before. And of course, inevitably and unfortunately, she ended up getting pinged. So she ended up with a fine for not having a current warrant and also for having worn tyres for a total of $350. So now she's paying that back in instalments as well, meaning she's spending roughly 33% of her income on transport related costs and mostly on fines and loan repayments for a car that she can't drive. She's also paying for the bus to and from uni and work, and she's feeling unsafe late at night waiting for public transport. She's getting home later from work and getting up earlier to get the bus to uni, so she's tired and she's stressed and her grades are starting to suffer. And there are many, many people in situations just like Hannah's or comparable situations in Aotearoa in 2021. Now, if we fast forward ourselves forward to 2040 and kind of imagine how it could be better, let's meet Aisha. So like Hannah, Aisha's 21 and she and her whānau live in a Kāinga community that produces net zero emissions. The residents of that community move between each other's homes on wide covered paths that allow for walking and wheeling. A few of the residents have cars, which they park at the perimeter of the development and charge them there, but most use one of several communal e-vehicles when they need to travel long distances. And these vehicles are also used as community shuttles at nights and in the weekends. So most days, Aisha takes a bus and a train to get to university where she's studying to be a teacher. The ticketing for this is integrated. She only waits a couple of minutes to transfer. And as a student, her public transport is free and takes about 25 minutes. Once a week, she takes her 3 younger cousins who also live in the same Kāinga community to the beach or a park on their bikes, and that's what they're doing in this picture. And so she's able to show her auntie some whanaungatanga by giving her a break, and they can use an extensive active transport network that connects their suburb to the rest of the city to get there. So it's wide enough for them to ride on to abreast so they can talk while they're riding, and Aisha can keep an eye on her younger cousins. Aisha receives a student allowance and it's indexed to the living wage, so she doesn't need to work on top of that, but she chooses to do 1 shift a week as a wait staff member for a catering company because she's saving for a trip to Rarotonga when she graduates. So if she finishes late at night, she can call the community shuttle, someone will pick her up, no questions asked, and same if she's out late with her friends or something like that. So as you can see, Hannah and Aisha, they're in very comparable situations, similar resources, similar backgrounds, but vastly different experiences, and the differences in their experiences are largely due to factors that govern transport and urban planning. So when we left Hannah, she was paying back a loan and fines on a car that she couldn't drive. She was catching the bus home from work late at night and feeling unsafe from getting hassled on the street. And so really, I think none of us would really blame her if she gave up and drove to work again under those circumstances. But if she did, she'd risk further fines and possibly even a criminal conviction, which could set her off on a very different path from the social work career that she's aspiring to. For Aisha, on the other hand, thanks to a meaningful Te Tiriti partnership and coordination between transport, housing and urban development, she's not only experiencing equitable mobility, but also equitable housing, income and employment as well. And so as a result, it's totally within her reach to plan an overseas trip to celebrate a significant milestone like a graduation. And unlike Hannah, the criminal justice system is just not even remotely on her radar. So really, if our leaders put the right policy and investment settings in place now, we could transform thousands of experiences like Hannah's into experiences like Aisha's in the next 2 decades. And that's where the fair path, or Te Ara Matatika, could lead us if we choose it and if our leaders choose the right policies and make the right decisions now. And so really that's where our conversation today is going to be focused on what that fair path to the future that we all want and need to see could look like. So I'll turn that off now and we'll get into our conversation. So I'd like to introduce now our speakers and give each of them an opportunity to say a few quick introductory comments as well. So first of all, Alec Tang. Alec is the Director of Sustainability at Kāinga Ora, and he's spent the bulk of his career developing innovative sustainability solutions across business, academia and the public sector. Most recently, before joining Kāinga Ora, Alec was working on the development of the Auckland Climate Strategy at Auckland Council, and he works on resilient and equitable urban environments, as well as lecturing on sustainable business at AUT. So tēnā koe, Alec, and I'll just throw to you to say a few opening things.
Ora Holly, nā mihi nui kia koutou, ko Bakgong Ngau, toka maunia ko Sātogo, toka awa ko Taiping Wan, toka moana ko Dang, toka iwi ko Alec Tang, toka ingoa no Gongha Chun Hungong no Birmingham, England, no Onihanga Tamaki Makaurau Ahau, no reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. And thanks, Holly, for the introduction and for sharing those stories. As you can imagine, both the previous work I've done at Council, but particularly the work that we're doing at Kāinga Ora really is at that focus of some of the most vulnerable communities living in public housing, but also the opportunity through our urban development activities to create some of those future states that you talked about. So really looking forward to this conversation and a really important conversation because, as you highlighted, we need to make those changes from a decarbonisation perspective, but we need to think really hard about how we do that so we don't just exacerbate those inequalities and those inequities that you've shared with us. So really looking forward to the conversation.
Kia ora, Alec, thank you. So next I'll introduce Peter McGlashan. So Peter is the lead advisor for Waka Kotahi's urban mobility team. So they're working on shaping conversations about how to improve the way we move around in our urban settings. And he's also a local government politician and a member of the Maunga Kia Tāmaki local board for Auckland Council. And so you may be familiar with this. Earlier this year, he led the Arthur Gray low traffic trial in Onehunga, became very contentious and a spark for community conflict. So some hard lessons learned, I guess, and hard experiences there that Peter will be able to reflect on from that perspective as well. So kia ora, Peter.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Thanks, Holly. Ko hikirangi te maunga ko Waipu te awa, ko Ngāti Parau te iwi, ko Peter McGlashan toko ingoa. Kei Waka Kotahi ahau e mahi ana, he lead advisor urban mobility, as mentioned, taku tūranga mahi. Really appreciate this opportunity to contribute to the conversation. Listening to those stories, I was getting flashbacks of my own university experience from Sandringham and the constant thoughts in my head as to whether I would or wouldn't get a car park, and the effect that that had on my attendance at university lectures. So there was there's lots of different ways that the choices that we have affect the outcomes, positive and negative, and those journeys are often not always foreseen when we make those first original choices about either where we live or the options we have to move around the city. So looking forward to contributing and sharing some of my experiences and how they may help others. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Peter, thank you. Next, I will introduce Erin Gough. So Erin is a lead advisor on rights at the Office of the Children's Commissioner and a former colleague of mine, in fact. But she's appearing today in her capacity both as a rights expert and I guess in her personal capacity as well. So Erin's worked in legal advocacy and policy roles in the community and public sectors, including Community Law Canterbury and the Human Rights Commission and the Ministry of Education. And she's also a passionate disability advocate. So Erin's been disabled since birth and is a really strong advocate for the rights of disabled people, and has some important perspectives, I think, to share about accessibility in our transport system. Kia ora, Erin.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. Sorry, I think I just froze, so that's not a good start. Ko Erin Gough tōku ingoa, tipe ake hau ki Afrika ki te tonga, ka rere takara hau e noho anea kei te tari o te kaikomihana mō ngā tamariki o Aotearoa e mahi ana. Kia ora tātou katoa. Kia ora everyone, as Holly says, wearing a few hats today, both as someone who works in children's rights, human rights, but a huge impact on disabled people's ability to live the lives that we want to lead. And so looking forward to sharing some of my experiences in that regard, and also really keen to centre children in this conversation as well. So thank you.
Kia ora, Erin. You were cutting in and out a little bit there. So yeah, hopefully that's not an issue that's going to continue, but we'll see how we go. And finally, I'd like to introduce Kumeroa Pihama. So as I said before, Kumeroa is the Pou Whanake, or the Technical Director Māori at WSP. And he's someone who's benefited from a lifetime immersion, full immersion Māori education, and being surrounded by his culture in every facet of his life. And since joining WSP, he's been leading iwi engagement on multiple projects and continues to do so in his current role. So tēnā koe, Kumeroa.
Tēnā koe, Holly. Tēnā rawa te tātou kai whakatikitiki. Koutou kua rau ika mai I raro I te maramaru o tēnei nā kaupapa o tātou. Nō reira mihi ana kia koutou. Nā koutou whakamahana I tēnei I ngā pātū o tēnei whare. I whakamana I tēnei rangi nō reira mihi ana. He whakahekinga tēnei no ngā maunga, no te maunga titohe a Taranaki, ko taupiri anō hoki tērā. Ngā ōku hononga he mea ki Ngāti Maru, ki Ngāti Mahanga, Te Atiawa, ngā mahanga atari anō hoki. So yes, really appreciative of the opportunity to take part in this kōrero today. And as Holly has mentioned, I guess the role that I play with WSP now is that of the Pou Whanake, Technical Director Māori. And already we've had a number of different perspective shares that really resonate. Holly, you mentioned my affiliation to Kura Kaupapa, and that in itself, having to travel from central Auckland to Kura out west, posed its own problems. But even through to today, so I'm calling today from Ngarua Wahia, but work and school for my children is within Kirikiriroa, and there's restrictions as a result of our travel opportunities there as well that I'm sure we'll unpack a little bit further as the call goes. But anō mihi ana kia koutou katoa.
Yeah, kia ora Kumeroa. Absolutely, yeah, really interesting examples there with kohanga reo and the distances travelled by whānau to access a te reo Māori education, which we can maybe talk about a bit more. So let's get into our discussion. I suppose I just wanted to start really from from first principles and talk about why transport and equity are so closely connected, because I think often they're not topics that are thought about together, at least in the policy space, or perhaps by those who are making decisions in this area, and they should be. So it's a good place to start. And Erin, I'd like to start with you. We've got a Q&A from Erin in our report, sort of illustrating some of the lived experience of being a wheelchair user in the transport system. And Erin, I wonder if you want to just perhaps don't take us through the whole thing, but give us a flavour really of what it can be like for you as a wheelchair user to access transport on a daily basis.
Sure. So yeah, a range of barriers really, and that kind of starts from when I leave my house onwards in terms of getting to the bus stop. I take a bus to work, I don't drive, and so I've actually just recently moved house, and it's been really illuminating in terms of having to get to the bus stop. The curbs are not suitable at all, and so I'm always stressed now as to whether I'm going to get stuck crossing the road, crossing a zebra crossing. So even that, just getting out of the house to the bus is a barrier. And then depends on the design of the bus really as to how easy or hard my commute's going to be. So some of the buses are really easy to get on. They're really new and lots of space for me to get on and off, but some of them aren't. And so that really is a cause of stress if it's an older bus and I don't have a lot of space to move around. Sometimes I have to reverse down the ramp, for example, which is obviously unsafe and quite stressful. It also kind of depends on the driver on the day as to what their attitude is towards putting down the ramp. And then as well, outside of kind of direct bus routes, it's really hard for me to get wheelchair accessible taxis, and it's almost impossible, in fact, in the evenings and on weekends. And so that really restricts where I can go, because if there's not a direct bus route, then I have to use some other form of transport. But unlike other people that can just rely on Ubers or Zoomies or a whole range of options, that's not an option for me. And so that really restricts what kind of life that I can lead in a lot of ways.
Kia ora, Erin. I think yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and that's just one individual experience, but I appreciate you bringing that perspective, because I think it's a really good example of the way that our current transport system, while it enables mobility for some people, is also very restrictive of the mobility of others. And in the report we look at, I suppose, who is most likely to be affected by constraints on their mobility in the transport system. Disabled people are very clearly in that category, as are Māori. So Kumeroa, I wondered if we could maybe elaborate on your comments earlier about, for example, transport to access Te Reo Māori education, but other ways as well in which I suppose our current transport system isn't upholding our te tiriti or waitangi obligations, in that Māori are much more likely to be disadvantaged in a number of different ways, including more likely to be harmed on the road in crashes and injuries. Have you got any reflections on that situation?
I mean, absolutely, and I'm sure the perspective will resonate with a lot of people in a lot of different situations, as they have already. So the I guess the daily commute from Central to West Auckland at the time, was upwards of an hour and a half, and school starts at a certain time, and not everything sort of matches up. So it could be 2 hours plus on public transport to simply to reach school. And that has a flow-on effect to how the rest of the day plays out, but also the opportunities to take part in additional activities associated with the learning process. And so there's multiple examples of those types of barriers that then I guess come up as a result. To be fair, within those time frames, so let's call it 4 hours a day as a young individual, there's plenty of opportunity to stray from the given path as well. So I will put that out there, wear that on my sleeve. And so it's not just the need to wake up early, but the compounding effects of those additional sort of downstream pieces that really have an effect on that we don't typically understand until we reach sort of an older age, where you know, the person that we've come to be at that point of time, you know, could have been it could have been added to in a much more considerable way by having the opportunity to simply take part. And so yeah, that's sort of a snapshot in that piece. But I guess with regards to the wider conversation, and I do see that there's already been a question pop up in relation to it. But yeah, it's not simply scheduling. It's not simply the infrastructure. It's not simply the you know, getting more out there. But I think you know, the additional values that you know, especially that mana whenua have the opportunity to provide. You know, that's a space that sort of as a nation we're growing in. But I really do think that maximising the understanding and the known obligation of mana whenua te kaitiakitanga, not only of the environment but of all the people who sort of transit through the rohe, you know, going through or reaching that true partnership when it comes to the investment will really maximise the outputs there.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to talk more in a minute about, I suppose, what that looks like on the ground, really, in terms of more meaningful involvement from mana whenua in transport decision making. But before we go there, Alec, I'm interested in, so you're at Kāinga Ora at the moment, homes and communities, and there are a lot of links, obviously, between where people live and how they live and how they get around, that impact on equity. So I just like, I suppose, you to perhaps introduce that housing and urban development piece to the picture in terms of where the current thinking on that is.
Thanks, Holly. And I think I just want to pick up on something that Kumeroa said around access to opportunity. And I think that's the critical thing here, right? You know, when we're thinking about cities and urban centres, there are a myriad of different things that make them function. And you know, as we highlight in my previous role at Auckland Council, we've got the Auckland Plan, which sets out 6 outcomes. And one of those is about transport and access. And that's really important because that transport and access allows you to deliver on some of the other things. So the access to opportunity, you know, the sense of belonging and participation, the natural environment. And we need to be able to, you know, move around, connect with those things so that we can build those other intangible elements actually are critical for a city. And so if we have a system, a transport system that prevents us or prevents people from doing that at a starting point, then we're never going to get to that point where actually we have a more holistic, more equitable, more resilient society as a whole. And for us, as I kind of alluded to at Kāinga Ora, you know, we have lots of questions and comments around affordable housing and what's affordable. And what's interesting is that's always focused about the cost of building the house and not the cost of living in that house. And I think that's a really important issue that kind of brings us back to transport, as, you know, some of the case studies you highlighted where there's a lot of investment's the wrong word, but a lot of spend on transport, which is dictated by where you are. So needing to shift that balance so that actually more people have that access to, whether it's an opportunity, whether it's simply accessing green space for like your health and well-being, whether it's accessing your friends, your neighbors to connect socially. You know, that's a really important issue from the broader urban development sense, not just as a transport issue in and of itself. So yeah, it is perhaps, and perhaps why we talk so much about it is because it is such a driver of all these other outcomes that we know are really important, particularly in for our cities as they grow, as they get bigger, as they get more dense as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, you know, I think Kumeroa's example actually also highlights it's much wider. Yes, it's much wider than transport. It incorporates everything to do with urban development, but also it's wider than that because that's an education policy question too, right? Like the availability of te reo Māori medium education and how accessible that is dictates how far people have to travel. So I think, you know, one outcome I'd really like to see as a result of this work and to contribute to wider thinking is how to connect up all the dots between transport policy and wider sort of social and economic policy as well. But Peter, I want to come to you because so as I said at the beginning, this report sort of focuses around the idea that we need to really prioritise two goals in the transport system, and one is reducing our dependence on cars, and one is improving equity in transport. And so I want to just kind of dig into that car dependency thing really, and talk about why that's so important, both from a climate change and decarbonisation perspective, but from a well-being and equity perspective as well. And would love your thoughts about that, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I guess how we ended up here is almost as sad a story as the current status. You know, I saw a graph yesterday about all the cities around New Zealand who had trams and things, you know, 40 or 50 years ago, and here we are kind of revisiting these concepts because there was a phase where, you know, the motor industry was extremely powerful. They spent most of the advertising dollars that were spent through the ad agencies and have led to planning decisions, which has led to sprawl. And we end up in a situation now where we're trying to walk back from some of those decisions because we understand the consequences a little bit more. So it's critical, I think anyone working in the transport industry recognises that to hit some of the emissions reduction targets that we've been asked to hit, to really respond to the climate crisis, the kilometres that each vehicle does, or the VKT, needs to come down. Now, you have a carrot and you have a stick, and the challenge for us as we get closer and closer to 2030 is the stick gets bigger and bigger and we start to run out of carrots. I think the low traffic neighbourhood trial in Onehunga that I was involved with was a classic example of that, where people hadn't quite grasped the change that is going to need to happen in the next 9 or 10 years. And there was this assumption that when we talk about people needing to change their behaviours, it wasn't them that we were referring to, or they failed to have a broader empathy for others. You know, Erin's example about her day, the challenges start as soon as she walks out her front door. Well, that challenge started when she was trying to find a house which was compatible to your needs, Erin. And I followed your journey on Twitter with that process. But if we don't get the footpaths right straight outside the doorway, and then we don't get the bus stop right, and then we don't get the places those buses go, the system breaks down, and we end up in a situation where social media and others starts to take over. You no longer head to the town square to get your version of the truth. You sit at home and you capture it from whatever your Facebook feed says. And I think the risk for us becoming more isolated, or there being a non-equitable transport system, is we do run the risk of ending up in these echo chambers of and that's dangerous, not just for democracy, but for the whole system and the way society holds itself together. So I think, you know, transport has a role to play in being the glue that kind of allows us to stay human. And if it fails, then it's a pretty slippery path to where we all might end up.
And I guess at the moment, part of the problem is that right now, we've got a very high rate of car ownership in Aotearoa New Zealand. We've got we spend a lot of our travel time in cars. You know, we've got for that reason, they're a major source of our climate change emissions. But for people thinking about what enables their freedom of mobility, their ability to participate in society, all those things that you were talking about, at the moment, that's very strongly associated with being able to get into your car and drive wherever you need to go. And I think that you know, the example you mentioned of the trial of the low traffic neighbourhood in Onehunga and the vehement opposition that encountered, albeit possibly not from the majority of residents, but from at least a very vocal minority, illustrates, I suppose, how deeply held those values and beliefs about car use equating to sort of freedom of mobility are.
And it's also it's a reality. Like yeah. It's the reason that assumption is held is because that is the reality, unfortunately.
That's right. And the way our cities are currently configured, that they drive, it's part of the pun, but they drive that to continue.
If I could just jump in there, because I think there's a really, you know, we talk about transport being such a critical part of our climate response, and it really is, not just because of the volume of emissions, but because of that point you guys are talking about in terms of the kind of the system complexity associated with transport and the degree of change that it will require, and that it requires us to do something that initially seems counterintuitive, because your point, Holly, about convenience, like cars are fantastic from a convenience perspective, or have enabled a whole bunch of stuff, and that change initially makes people think, oh well, there's an inconvenience factor here because there's a change, because there's a quite a significant change that we need to see, but we need to push through that to see some of the broader benefits that we see. And we also need, to solve that, or to solve the transport emissions part, which effectively your best way of reducing transport emissions is to avoid trips. It's not moving mode, it's actually avoidant. And that's actually an urban development issue, not a transport issue. And so what transport provides is this real lens into say, look, to solve this problem of transport emissions, we need to think about this urban development question over here, not just look at the transport issue. And so I think this is why it's so exciting and interesting to think about transport in that context, because it actually adds or really illustrates the complexity that we have from a climate change perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it illustrates too that we're not going to get the change required by just asking individuals to change their behavior. And I think where a lot of that resistance and sort of frustration and anger comes from for some projects like this, because it's within a wider system that's not designed to set up that change. We can't expect people to sort of make these changes in pockets. We need to be looking across the whole system at how we can make systems level policy and investment change that's going to drive those kinds of changes. Erin, I want to come to you now, because whilst we need to do that, whilst we need to sort of make those changes at that big picture level to encourage urban design that reduces the need for trips and shortens the distances between key destinations and encourages mode shift, there are, I think, risks in how we do that we may inadvertently end up further restricting the mobility of some people. So I wondered if you could just reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the key example that comes to mind of people I've heard in Wellington have a lot of concerns is the Golden Mile, the car-free Golden Mile, and the idea that people who need accessible transport options and who need a car for accessibility reasons may need to show some sort of pass or something like that to kind of prove that they need that mode of transport. But the problem with that is it exacerbates a level of ableism, because it requires people to prove that they are disabled enough for that. Whereas I think that the onus of proof really should be on non-disabled people to show, why they need a car, essentially, in terms of, like, if you provide a lot of accessible and active transport options, you should be able to assume without judgment that anyone who is using a car for whatever reason has a good reason to do so. So I think it's about shifting the onus again from the individual to the system to be able to respond and be able to provide an option for everyone. But for some disabled people, cars are mobility aids and they should be treated as such. And this is sort of a separate topic, but related in that it's actually very expensive to get accessible cars. Like, it's, I think, about 80K to get a car that I could potentially drive with my power chair. And there's not nearly enough funding to be able to do that. So again, the people that have those options are already very privileged, and there needs to be some kind of system response to that as well, in terms of allowing people who need that as an option to access it. So yeah, just a few things to think about there.
Yeah, thank you. I really like that. I really like that perspective, really, that yes, it requires the policy change and the infrastructure change to be available, but if there are, good public transport, good active transport connections available, the expectation should be that those are used. I see Kumeroa has just dropped off the video, but I was about to come to you, Kumeroa, so I hope you're available. I wanted to reflect on, or invite you to reflect on, I suppose, a lot of the solutions in this space going forward into the future are going to require partnership with iwi Māori and partnership with kaupapa Māori organisations, and really meaningfully involving mana whenua in transport decision making and urban design and development. And I'm interested really to know what, first of all, what you think some of the barriers perhaps are to that happening more at the moment and how we can remove some of those, and then what best practice looks like in terms of partnering with Māori to make some of these types of changes.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to. I think before I get into it, though, I do want to sort of qualify my comments by saying that that mana whenua in their different forms are really the only organisation, or the only entities, the only representative entities that are across all of these different topics that we've discussed. There's so much silo operation going on, and the common denominator there is mana whenua being involved at sort of one level or another, but across the board. So I think when it comes to bringing all of this together, that mana whenua have played that crucial role for a considerable amount of time, and we see it emerging now. It's the flash catchphrase at the moment. But Kaitiaki have been sort of maintaining our environmental relationship since I guess sort of the initial sort of migration of non-Māori into Aotearoa. But then over the last 40 years, and sort of as technical experts sort of considered by the various industries that we work in. So I did want to put that on the table first. And so I guess with regards to the limitations, first and foremost, it's recognition of the technical capability that mana whenua, that Kaitiaki bring to the table. So I'm fortunate, and WSP's fortunate that we've sort of been able to develop a framework that is able to reflect that in the house. But realistically, I think across the board, that's probably our number one barrier or restriction. But then also there's in a similar way to the transport conversation we're having at the moment, there are sort of so many inefficiencies within the way we operate globally, that there's layers of pressure on our iwi representatives that could be I guess worked through more efficiently, or support mechanisms put in place to support them, because I guess I'll close off with the last with my last comment being these representatives, especially our Koroeke and our Ruruhi, they have a governance role to play. Let's be clear about that. They shouldn't be the administrator. They shouldn't be sort of the logistical planner and those types of things. Their governance, and they should and so we should treat them as such.
Kia ora. And yes, you're right. I suppose a risk of mana whenua having that cross-cutting perspective, looking at all of these issues together, is government agencies come to them one at a time to consult about individual issues, and it's extremely time-consuming and resource-intensive. So that's something I think that all agencies need to do better. I want to move.
Sorry, Holly, can I just jump in on something
Sure.
that Kumeroa said in terms of like the importance of iwi Māori perspective and actually a te ao Māori framing, and just to reflect on some work that we're doing at Kāinga Ora, slightly left field, but around urban ngāhere, around urban forest, and the discussions we've had with mana whenua is recognizing that this isn't just about planting trees, this is about building connections between the community and the natural environment, and that if we're talking about ngāhere means the forest environment, not just the trees but the broader ecosystem that it enables, the water, the land, and it becomes a more holistic picture. So if you bring that across to transport, then that gives you the sense that we're not just talking about the transport mode, we're talking about those connections and what Peter talked about in terms of actually it's getting to that, and it's this wider context that actually you need to resolve all these other issues, or there's an opportunity to resolve all these other issues through that conversation about transport. So I think that that framing around te ao Māori is a really important framing for all our sustainability, equity issues, and it needs to be stronger to the fore in the policy decisions or in the structure of our government departments, as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And a great example of where meaningful Te Tiriti o Waitangi partnership comes into the frame for this stuff. I want to come to questions from our viewers to make sure we get to a good number of those before we finish up at 1 o'clock. And the first one here is from Henry Cook. Now, Peter, I'm going to put this to you, but I suspect that you may be somewhat constrained in what you can say here. So offer whatever reflections you'd like to, and then I'm happy to sort of to add some thoughts to it too. So Henry says, for Peter and maybe Holly, a complaint made by people around Parliament about Waka Kotahi NZTA is that they simply aren't set up to see their main role as anything other than building roads. Everything else is kind of a nice to have. So he'd love your thoughts on whether that's accurate and whether root and branch reform is needed to the actual agency to change that. So to the extent that you're able, Peter, would like to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, in the 3 or 4 months that I've been at Waka Kotahi, no, I mean, our team is the opposite of that, but that's natural. You know, our team, the urban mobility team, sits within multimodal and innovation. So I guess we are the agitators within Waka Kotahi. We are the ones looking over the horizon about e-scooters and changes, and you know, the role of open streets and safer school streets and rail. And you know, I guess our part of the business is definitely much more systems focused, but it's unavoidable to acknowledge the fact that Waka Kotahi traditionally has been primarily state highways and roads and more roads, and that balance changes obviously with it being a delivery agency of the government. As governments change from left to right and centre, the priorities change, and I think the challenge for those that are on the ground doing the work is it's not good for anyone to swing too far one way and then back, because it creates an indecisive environment for everyone. The challenge at the moment is there's decades of work to catch up on, and many of the things that we thought from a climate crisis perspective, which we thought were going to be decades ahead of us, are now happening. And so the sense of urgency really has to land with some of these big parts of government. I think the politicians are potentially more progressive and understanding that. I think parts of organisations like Waka Kotahi, particularly where we are, understand that. And the challenge is getting those two things to meet. You know, the grassroots are calling out for it. The politicians reflect the grassroots. And now we're in a situation where the squeeze is starting to happen on those that actually do the delivery. So Henry, while people around Parliament, I'm not sure if he's meaning the journos or the officers, it's a natural criticism, but I think anyone sitting around this panel understands the urgency, and that's why we strive to work for these big organisations, which traditionally, you know, I come from a community development background. I never would have thought that I would have been working for the organisations that I have. I mean, Alec's the same. We walk a fine line between challenging the organisations that we work for and maintaining the company line. So it's a challenge for all of us if we want to try and shift the needle.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Peter. One quick thought I'll add in response to that is, I suppose where this report is trying to pitch the recommendations, and the central recommendation we have about reprogramming the transport system around different goals and outcomes, is that at that central level, if we make reduced VKT, reduced car dependence and increased equity, the outcomes that the transport system needs to deliver on, then that flows on to, you know, how we prioritise investment by Waka Kotahi, for example, and it would spit out a very different pattern of investment from what we've seen in the past.
And the Innovating Streets for People project, which, you know, caused a lot of controversy, was a classic example of that, where that was Waka Kotahi being willing to fund something which did challenge the system, did challenge the BAU, and really challenge the road controlling authorities to do things a little bit differently. So there are parts of Waka Kotahi that are trying to redirect the ship and to challenge the status quo, and how those land within the public and whether they're accepted by politicians is the balance, is the dance. And reports like this are a wonderful way of starting new conversations, or potentially converting the middle who haven't necessarily had a strong opinion either way.
Yeah,
I'd actually flip Henry's question upside down and go, well, actually we need to recognise that transport isn't just an NZTA issue, that actually it's an urban development and housing issue, and that it should be part of what we're trying to push it's a health issue, it's an it's not just sitting in one. And this goes back to one of your earlier points, Holly, where we need to recognize there are lots of parts of the system, and we can't just depend on one part to change for this all to happen. Like, one of the big things for us at Kāinga Ora is we can have some really cool infrastructure, but if we don't help address the car dependency of the people in our houses, if we don't provide some wraparound support, some social support on that to provide these are the different options you can use, then that infrastructure just won't get used, or won't get used as much as it could. So I think there's also a flip around to say, we can't just say, oh, it's a transport issue, hey, Waka Kotahi, what are you going to do to solve this? We actually need other agencies to go, actually, it's part of our opportunity that we can actually deliver some benefit around.
Yeah, which, I suppose government agencies notoriously are not great at collaboration, but many of the big challenges we face are ones that require major collaboration. A question from Simon McManus for Erin and Kumeroa. So Simon says, on top of the urban design considerations, technology is regarded as an enabler for mode shift away from single occupancy car use, helping decarbonisation. Interested to hear your thoughts on how we might ensure technology solutions like PT apps, public transport apps, for an example, enhance equity, recognising that one size doesn't fit all. Erin, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Yeah, I was just thinking about this question, and obviously I'm a wheelchair user, so I come from that perspective, but I can see technology being really helpful for other communities as well, who experience transport barriers due to disability, like the blind community, for example. Have a lot of blind friends who face different, but just as big barriers getting around, and I can foresee that having some sort of focus on technology for them in terms of being able to navigate things in different ways may be really helpful. I think for me as well, there's something about, I'm just thinking about wheelchair taxis at the moment, and how there's not really been much innovation in how they're kind of used, or kind of thinking about, rather than having a big van that's got a hoist and they all cost about $100,000, how we can utilize kind of technology to be, to have smaller cars that can fit both wheelchairs and people that don't use wheelchairs in terms of getting around, and how we can, design things to be a bit more compact, so it's not such a big cost barrier to invest in these things. And yeah, I think technology does play a really complementary role, and particularly around disability is not something that is particularly well invested in. I think about my own power chair and how bulky and hard it is to get around. That has a huge impact on the types of transport that I can take. And so if there was the same investment that there has been in car design, that there has been in wheelchair design, and thinking about how wheelchairs could be designed to be easier to get around, I think I would be in a very different place. So again, that just sort of speaks to what groups in society get prioritized, really. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Kumeroa, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, tough topic to follow. So I think I might flip it again and say that if we have a look instead to our past and the opportunities that came as a result of that. I mean, the most the form of transport with the lowest footprint is a waka. There's no degrading the banks of the river. It's a carbon neutral product, and so on and so forth. So I think there are lots of lessons of within our past that we're able to bring forward into our future. And I mean, Peter touched on it before. We're now seeing the results of previous policy or historic policy. So yeah, I think Erin captured it really well. So I thought I'd just add that slightly different dynamic to the answer.
Thank you. Now, look, we're going to run out of time soon, and there are a lot of really great questions here, as this always happens. So my apologies to those who've asked questions we're not going to get to. I would like to squeeze in one more before we close, though, which is from Darren Ponter, and it's about free public transport. So one of the recommendations in our report is that we consider making public transport free for particular groups, so under 25s, tertiary students, community services card holders. But Darren's question, I think, is perhaps more general. Are we ready for the journey to free public transport? what do we need to do as a country to get there, and will that be enough in itself to get substantial mode shift? Now, I know we've only got 4 minutes, but if any of our panelists have quick thoughts about whether free public transport is the answer or part of the answer, or how much of the answer to these challenges, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, if I could jump in quickly, I think the fact that we have to have this conversation in a forum like this means that we're not ready. And Peter's and even yourself have shared experiences of times where we've tried to do something and we're not ready. But you know, we can't let perfect stand in the way of good. So in actual fact, I'd be looking for something that's even more inclusive. You know, it's not the whānau with the 1.5 litre car, but it's the millionaire with the 6 V8s. You know, obviously they all have an impact, but you know, I think our sort of our affluent community will benefit as much from free public transport as anybody else.
I'd just chuck one thing in, and I think there's another issue that we need to resolve before the free is the where. So, I mean, from our perspective, you know, we have developments where the people in our houses are going out to Māngere or to the airport district, not to the central city. So it can be free public transport. If it's not going to where the people need to go, then it won't get any more uptake. And I think, you know, those of you in Auckland have seen those maps of where increased public, you know, we're going to put more bus, like there are some big holes in our network where we actually need to see more variable routes to different places. And that's a challenge, not just the cost as well.
Yeah, I would talk of that in terms of like, it could be as free as it likes, but in terms of if it's not accessible, then a whole lot of disabled people aren't going to be able to access that. So I think a focus on the infrastructure in parallel to the cost would be necessary.
Thanks, everybody. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there in terms of the questions answered, but I've dropped my email address in the chat. So if anybody would like to get in touch to follow up about this report or anything raised in the webinar, or if you've got feedback, particularly about the live captioning, but other aspects of the webinar too, please do feel free to get in touch. And apologies that we haven't been able to get through all the questions. There's so many more interesting things we could be talking about. But look, I'll close now, and I want to just again thank our panelists so very, very much for your participation and your expertise. It's a fantastic panel, and I think I know I've got some new thoughts to take away as a result of this discussion, and it's really great to have had you all as part of our panel. So thank you for your time. Thank you to our Helen Clark Foundation members who support the work of the foundation and make it possible for us to do things like this. And I think Paul will have dropped a link in the chat there to how to become a member of the foundation if you'd like to support this program of work, this type of research and other events like this that we hold. We're about to advertise another webinar next week on Monday with Julia Gillard and Helen Clark about women in leadership, which I think will be fantastic. So we'll soon share the links to that, and I hope some of you will be interested in signing up for that. And to thank WSP as well again for your ongoing support of the foundation, the partnership we have, which is able to produce work like this, and I think is, you know, we're contributing to some really important conversations here that we need to be having as a country. So thank you again to Kumeroa and to WSP in general for that ongoing support of us. So with all of that said, I'll close with karakia whakamutunga for us all. Kua mutu a mātou mahi mo tēnei wā. Mana ki te mai mātou katoa o mātou hoa, o mātou whānui, ao ki te aorangi. Tihei mauri ora. So thank you all so much for participating today. Thank you for your questions. Do get in touch if you've got further thoughts, and I wish you a really good rest of your day, rest of your week, and rest of your year, which is now nearly over, thankfully. Kia ora, everybody. Thank you so much.